The father came home from the army and found his daughter sleeping in a pigsty. No one expected his reaction. Gale came back without warning. The pack on his back felt lighter than the silence in his chest. 4 years away, 4 years in deserts, trenches, and the back alleys of cities that didn't speak his language. But no place was as cruel as his own memories. He didn't expect cheers or hugs when he stepped back into the village. He didn't expect stares either. And that's exactly what he got. Nothing. People who'd known him since he was a kid passed by as if he were just dust in the wind. And still, he walked on. He knew where he needed to go. At the bottom of his pack was a bundle of letters, creased and dirty, scrawled in shaky ink, childish handwriting trying to describe the unspeakable. "Daddy, I was all alone again today. She said if I cried, I wouldn't get any food. There's no light here. I'm scared when rats run over my feet." The letters came from Aylin, his daughter. Elias, an old friend who still looked ashamed for doing the right thing, had sent them. Gale read each one like he was taking blows in silence. When he entered the village, he noticed that nobody wanted to meet his eye. No children playing in the streets like before. Windows were wide open, but no voices drifted out. Everything pointed to something awful, except the people themselves. He arrived at the house, his old house. A crooked wooden gate, a yard overrun with weeds, the same faded beige curtains swaying in the breeze. But the absence of children's laughter was deafening. He called for Aylin. No answer. He went inside. The living room was clean, orderly, a fake home. Every corner screamed what his eyes refused to believe, far too much order for someone caring for a child. He passed through the kitchen, the bedrooms, empty, and then he heard it. Not a cry, not a shout, a creak, an ancient hinge. Out back, beside the chicken coop, was the door to the pigsty. When he opened it, he almost couldn't believe it, though he half did because he'd read every letter. Aylin lay there in a corner on filthy straw. Her arms were thin, her knees raw, her lips cracked, but she didn't look scared. She looked numb. She stared at him for a few painfully long seconds. No tears, no words. Then she scrunched her nose and murmured, "Dad." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, like recognizing a smell you thought you'd forgotten, like realizing a spark of love still lived somewhere inside you. Gale dropped to his knees. He wanted to say he was there now, that nothing would ever happen to her again, that he'd do everything differently, but he didn't say a word. He just scooped her into his arms. She didn't struggle, didn't even blink, just rested her head on his shoulder. His clothes got dirty, his hands shook, but her eyes started to see again. And that's how it began anew. No promises, no speeches, just a dad who came home, and a little girl who, by some miracle, still recognized his scent. The house Gale chose to start over in wasn't much. 4 crumbling walls, a sagging roof, the smell of mold and past regrets. It used to belong to his parents, a childhood place. Now it was their shelter. Aylin slept on 2 folded blankets on the floor. The first days were almost wordless. She'd wake at every noise, eat slowly, tuck food into her pockets. Even looking at the bathroom door would freeze her in place. It wasn't fear, it was habit. Gale didn't push. He just showed up, every day, every moment. He made coffee, washed clothes, swept the floor, always calmly, always making it clear she didn't need to hide anymore. One chilly afternoon, he noticed something new. Aylin watched him as he fixed a door. She didn't run, didn't curl into herself. She just watched. When he finished, she held out a hairbrush without a word. He sat down. She came closer. With skinny little hands trembling, she began to brush his hair. It was the first time she'd touched him. Outside, the village went on as if nothing had happened. Gale would walk past familiar faces, pretending not to see. Everyone seemed too busy to remember the girl who'd been left here for years. But he saw their guilt in their eyes. People crossed the street when they saw him. Others looked down. Gale didn't shout, didn't confront anyone. He just memorized their faces. Who saw, who knew, who chose not to care. Elias came looking for him one night, alone, bearing bread and a haunted look. "I should have done more," he said. "She was there every day, crying softly. I heard her when I walked by." Gale didn't answer. Elias pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket, folded tight. Another letter. This one was different. Aylin's handwriting, but bigger letters, steadier strokes. "Today I thought about running away, but I don't even know where the street is." Elias hesitated, then admitted he hadn't retrieved the letters. Someone else had. Someone suffering too. Someone who asked to stay in the dark. Someone named Ezekiel. Gale didn't ask any more questions. He just tucked the note away and went back inside. In the living room, Aylin had drawn 2 stick figures on a yellowed sheet of paper. One was him. The other, her. They were holding hands. It was the first drawing without bars, without a pigsty, without blood. And then Gale knew the healing had begun, and the village, no matter how hard it tried to pretend otherwise, would have to listen. Aylin's drawings began to multiply, always at the end of the day. After her bath, after the hot bread, after the shared silence. She'd grab scraps of used paper, bits of newspaper, pieces of wrapping paper, sit on the floor and scratch out the past with a precision no child should ever have. In one, a little girl trapped inside a box. In another, a broom raised over a smaller silhouette. And then, the heaviest of all, a woman smiling while another wept, trapped in a corral. Gale studied each picture in silence. He filed them all away in a folder. He knew they were more than memories. They were evidence, voices that hadn't been heard. It was Leticia who came first. She knocked on the door like someone unsure if she even wanted him to answer. She carried only a threadbare coat and eyes that wouldn't meet his. I looked after her. For a little while at least, her voice faltered. When I tried to stop it, she kicked me out. Said if I opened my mouth, she'd tell everyone I was the one hitting her. Leticia told him Aylin was beaten with a bamboo stick, fed scraps, locked up as punishment for bad behavior. She just wanted to play, just wanted someone to hold her. Gale didn't cry. He simply wrote down everything. Leticia left a signed note, a name added to the dossier. The next day, another knock. Carmen, a former teacher at the village school, removed after a conflict with Aylin Herrera's guardian. She'd kept documents, overlooked report cards, requests for home visits that were never answered. I warned the principal. No one would get involved. They said Sylvia was a good woman, that she had problems at home but was devout, that she cared for the girl as best she could. Gale listened without interruption. Then he asked, "Will you testify?" "I will." Meanwhile, Aylin kept drawing. In one picture, she added 3 figures beside the little girl. A woman in a bun and a long skirt, Leticia. A woman with her hair tied back and a pencil behind her ear, Carmen, and the bearded man holding her hand. It was the first time Aylin drew herself surrounded by living people, by protection, and in the caption, scribbled in blue ink, a single sentence, "The good people are coming." That's when Gale knew he wasn't alone anymore. Sylvia didn't hide. Instead, she began to show up around the village more often, chin up, steps measured, always in modest clothes, hair tied back, carrying herself like a respectable woman. Her facade was perfect, but the cracks were there. She claimed Gale was ungrateful, that he didn't understand what it took to raise a daughter alone, that Aylin had always been difficult, nervous, uncontrollable. The same story she'd told for years to cover up the muffled screams, the dark circles under the girl's eyes, her absence from parent-teacher meetings. But now there were names, dates, witness statements, letters, and above all, drawings. Gale made no public statements. He took action. He went to the crass office in the neighboring town and requested copies of all aid records. He discovered Sylvia had received government funds as the caregiver of an orphan child with special needs. Over 20,000 reals in 4 years. No inspections had been carried out. No social worker ever knocked on the door. The manipulation went beyond words. It was in the letterhead, the forged signatures, the blind trust of a system that prefers to believe whoever looks normal. Meanwhile, Gale's house was becoming something new. Leticia returned to help. Carmen brought books, a chalkboard, small stools. Aylin for the first time laughed, a shy, brief, unmistakable laugh, when a village kid stumbled over spelling her name aloud. The girl who wouldn't speak was now teaching letters. Sylvia didn't realize it yet, but she was already losing, and not just in court. She was losing in the place that hurts most, in the memories of the children. It was on a rainy night that the past knocked again. Gale was organizing Aylin's drawings, now catalogued by date, when he heard footsteps outside. He opened the door and saw no one, but on the ground lay a plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a note with just a few words. "I wasn't her, it was me. My name is Ezekiel." Gale closed the door gently, clutched the paper in his hand and thought, the truth, bit by bit, is revealing itself. He showed up the next morning. He didn't knock on the door. He stood on the other side of the fence, waiting to be noticed. He looked young, maybe 23 or 24. Worn boots, a sparse beard, hands made rough by hard work and little trust. When Gale saw him, he said nothing. He just stared. Ezekiel lifted the empty envelope Gale already knew. "I'm the one who told Elias about her." His voice was steady but low, as if he was still apologizing for existing. He didn't beat around the bush. He was Sylvia's biological son, never legally acknowledged. He'd grown up bouncing between farms and friends' houses, always carrying the shame of being the problem child. At 9, they left him with a distant aunt. At 14, he was on his own. The last time I saw my mother, she told me I was worthless, that I was just like the dad who vanished. Years later, he'd come back to the village for a quick job and seen Aylin, skinny, filthy, climbing out of that pigsty with a bucket in her hand. He couldn't bring himself to talk to her, but he couldn't carry that alone. So he found Elias and asked for help. I was too scared to show my face, too ashamed. And now, Gale asked for the first time. Ezekiel met his gaze and said, "Now I want to stay." Gale didn't reply. He just opened the gate. Over the next days, Ezekiel pitched in. He fixed benches, repaired windows, dug a trench for the rainwater. He didn't say much, but he watched everything. Aylin took her time warming up. Then one morning, she sat beside him as he sanded a table. They sat for nearly an hour without speaking. When he finished, she left a folded scrap of paper on the wood. It was a drawing, 3 figures, her, Gale, and Ezekiel, standing side by side, each holding a tool. Beneath it, in her small, neat letters, "Building something else." That night, Ezekiel asked Carmen to teach him to read. "I never went to school," he said, "but I want to understand Aylin's books." Carmen smiled through tears, and for the first time, Gale realized that families aren't just made of blood, they're made of choice. Gale didn't pursue justice in anger, he did it methodically. The dossier was complete. Letters, drawings, medical reports, testimonies from Leticia and Carmen, crass records, the trail of wrongful payments, all organized, numbered, copied. He went to the prosecutor's office in the next city, out of Sylvia's reach, and handed it over with a simple note. "I don't want revenge. I want the truth. The investigation began immediately. In the village, everyone noticed. Sylvia tried to bribe Elias into silence with veiled threats. She claimed Carmen was manipulating a traumatized child and whispered that Gail was unhinged, out to extort money from the community. But the masks wouldn't stick anymore. Letitia was called to testify. She sobbed in front of the prosecutor. Carmen turned over the piles of documents she'd kept for years. Elias recorded a video, reading Aylin's letters in his own voice. That video spread, first among neighbors, then in church and in group chats. People who'd never even read a complaint heard the pain of a little girl who'd lived just yards from their homes. Slowly, they began to visit Gail's house, bringing eggs, fruit, old notebooks. One mom even brought her 8-year-old son. He doesn't speak much. Could he sit with you for a while? Suddenly the house turned into a school. Carmen held reading circles in the yard. Ezekiel strung a clothesline for drying new drawings. Aylin wrote her name in big, bright letters and taped it to the wall. Children trickled in, 2 at first, then 5. Some wounded, others just forgotten. Aylin didn't talk much, but when a little girl burst into tears because she couldn't hold the pencil right, Aylin quietly took her hand and showed her how to grip it properly. No words, just a gentle, guiding touch. That night, Gail looked around and saw something he'd never seen before. It wasn't just a house. It was a refuge, a trench of care. And in that silence, brimming with life, he knew that even the weakest, when they band together, learn to shout. The verdict came out on an ordinary late afternoon. No spectacle, no crowd, just a sheet of paper with harsh words. 12 years in prison, no parole. Name, Sylvia Montero. Charges, fraud, child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, identity fraud. The most serious count, willful neglect of a child's suffering. The news spread fast. Some villagers fell silent, others feigned surprise. But there was a new sound in the air, not outrage, but relief. Gail didn't celebrate. He didn't go around saying, "I told you so." He simply returned home, as always. There, Aylin sat beneath a tree, teaching a younger child how to write her name. Ezekiel was painting the window slats with a focus almost childlike. Carmen arranged donated books on freshly installed shelves. Gael took a seat on the porch bench and watched. He breathed in deeply, lighter than he had in a long time. That night, Aylin brought in 2 plates of food. They sat together on the living room floor. She looked at him with clear, steady, still childish, but whole voice and said, "You're staying, right?" Gail didn't need words to reply. He grabbed a notebook, opened to a blank page, and wrote a single word, "Yes." Then he pushed the notebook to her. Aylin read it and smiled. The next day, the house officially became a school. No name, no sign, no registration, but full of purpose. Children arrived with empty backpacks and eager eyes. Some hungered for food, others for someone to listen. All thirsted for care. The village that had once looked away began to move. A father fixed a bench. A grandmother brought homemade bread. A young man from the market dropped off reams of printer paper. Not because anyone asked, because shame had become impulse. Because shared pain was turning into collective strength. Sylvia was taken away. But what she'd broken wouldn't be healed by courts alone. It would be healed here, in practice, every day. Time passed unhurriedly. No fanfare, no headlines, just life moving forward, like all things that are real and need no proof. The school grew slowly. The once wounded house became a sanctuary. Walls were painted by small hands with donated paint. The blackboard was an old door repurposed. Books trickled in, some read until their covers fell off, others handwritten by volunteers who remembered how to teach. Aylin now spoke with confidence, not all the time, but when she spoke, everyone listened. She taught little ones to write, to draw, to count, and without knowing it, taught them how to trust. She didn't become happy or a symbol of triumph. She still carried silence in her eyes, but it no longer hurt. It was simply presence. Ezekiel became part of the backbone. He tended the garden, repaired furniture, read slowly with his finger under each line, and smiled at the end of every paragraph, as if he'd won a battle all his own. Carmen carried on with lessons. Leticia, now fearless, helped in the kitchen. And Gail planted. In the yard, he set young fruit trees into the soil. He said he wanted shade, but Aylin knew better. He was planting roots. The community, once cowardly, now showed up. Not with speeches, but with bags of bread, spare hours to sweep the floor, and respectful silence when children spoke of their feelings. Here, no one asked what you'd been through. They only asked, do you want to learn? Do you want to help? If you said yes, you were welcome. It was simple, it was honest, and that's why it was strong. One day, a reporter arrived wanting to tell the story of the school built by survivors. Gail refused. This story isn't about survivors, it's about caregivers. And caregiving isn't a headline, it's a routine. That very afternoon, Aylin read aloud a story to 10 children seated on the floor. Ezekiel hammered a new shelf in the back. Gail brushed dirt from his hands and watched, eyes of someone who's seen too much yet still chose to stay. The imaginary camera pulls back. We see trees growing, children laughing, notebooks open to the sun, scars that haven't vanished but no longer command. In that transformed house, it was proven what no one wanted to see before. True justice isn't only found in convictions, it's found in persistent care, in daily presence, and in the simple miracle of watching what was broken bloom. If this story moved you, tell me with one word. What do you think heals most, time, love, or presence? Leave a like and subscribe so more stories like this reach those who need to hear them. Thanks for staying with me.